Hey guys, what's up? Welcome back to the channel. It's Cynicalex, and today I want to tackle all of the most common terminology in Marvel Future Fight. I'm talking acronyms, I'm talking abbreviations, words that we use offhand that I use a lot in my videos, but I don't always take the time to explain what they are because it would be repetitive and because it would break the flow of the video. So it's a roughly top 20 terminology in Marvel Future Fight. It may be more or less depending on what you think of each term specifically, but let's get into it by talking about iframe and iframe ignore. So in the very simplest of terms, an iframe stands for invincibility frame, and it's basically a frame in the game. The game is made up of frames. Everything that's moving is made up of frames in the digital world, so you're talking television shows, movies, even those live photographs for iPhone. And basically an iframe is where during the frame of an attack you cannot be targeted and you cannot take any damage. So you'll see that by a red X appearing either on the character or above the character or below the character. So his fourth skill has an iframe, his second skill has an iframe there, and I believe at the end of his third skill or something like that, there's also an iframe when he actually hits, but you have to get hit in order for that to trigger specifically. Now, if you're still confused as to what an iframe is, I'll give you two very simple examples. If you've ever played Super Mario and you've ever gotten a star, the star makes Mario flash a whole bunch of different colors and it plays that tune. Do 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 do. So for the duration of that star effect, Mario can't take any damage. That's invincibility. Invincibility frame, iframe, is the same thing. Just imagine that every time you have an iframe skill, it puts you in that star state from Mario for just that period of time, just that short, brief, whatever it is, for however long the skill is. Longer skills that have longer iframes will give you longer invincibility frames, more invincibility frames. If you want a more recent example, for those of you younger gamers, if you've ever played Dark Souls or Bloodborne or more recently Remnant, when your character rolls and you can't take damage during the roll, that's an iframe. Iframe ignore is what Silver Surfer has on his third skill, Cyclops has on his third skill, Winter Soldier has on his fourth skill, Captain Marvel has on her fourth skill, and Nova has on his second skill. And these are skills that basically allow you to attack someone when they are in an iframe, so that's why they're super powerful. The next thing I want to talk about is a damage proc, and a damage proc is very important because we talk about it so much for any kind of PvE content. Now it's that last part there at the bottom, increases damage by X for one attack's 5 seconds. That is the damage proc. If it looks like anything else in terms of any different kind of text, it's not a damage proc. Now that number, that 200%, that can change. It can be a different percentage. It could be 180%. It could be 160. This is 180%. It could be 160. It could go down to 120. There's 160. There's 140. You can even have a 100% damage proc if you have a 5-star obelisk. But that is what they look like. If it says anything else about damage falling on the head, if it's more than 200% or less than 100%, it is not a damage proc. Proc is short for process, doesn't really make sense. We just call it a damage proc. It's the thing that boosts your damage at a specific time. The next one is guaranteed dodge and guaranteed crit. Now these are pretty straightforward once you can understand them. Dodge is your ability to avoid an attack. Crit is your ability to do more damage with any given attack, and there's a chance to crit. It's just like a chance to hit the weak spot of the enemy. So for guaranteed dodge, it basically gives you 2 chances to dodge. So first, if your guaranteed dodge is active, you'll have a chance to dodge based on what your guaranteed dodge is. So if it's 50%, it'll be 50% chance. If it's 90%, it'll be a 90% chance. And if your guaranteed dodge is not up, or if your guaranteed dodge fails the roll, then it will also check for your regular dodge. So it basically gives you an extra chance to dodge. In the case of guaranteed crit, it gives you an extra chance to crit, and when you crit, it applies your crit damage multiplier onto the attack. So instead of hitting for 100, if you have a 200% crit damage modifier, you would hit for whatever, 200 or 300, whatever the stat would be. Don't make me do the math. It would just hit for more damage. That's what a crit is. It's basically just more damage. The next ones that I want to talk about are a bunch. W, BU, GBR, ABX, AC, TL, SL, WBI, and WE. I'm not going to go through them. You can see what they are right now, and people will refer to them. Normally, they don't say it out loud except for like GBR, ABX, and AC, and maybe SL. Those ones really flow, but like W, BU is really awkward to say, so people usually just type these out. So if you see these typed out on Discord, Twitter, Line Chat, you know, where did you get that CTP? Oh, I got it from GBR. Then you know they're talking about Dr. Spaghetti. That's exactly what they're talking about. So that is what that means. One of the most popular phrases that I often utter is DPS. DPS stands for damage per second, and it basically is a way of expressing, just in a quick way, that a character does a lot of damage. If a character does a lot of damage, they have high DPS. If a character doesn't do a lot of damage, they have low DPS. Now, it can become a much more complicated thing when you talk about like ramp up, because certain characters require some time to build up their damage before they can deal a lot of damage. Like, you know, for example, some characters, let's say old Captain America Infinity War, he did very low damage until you built up his 6th skill. So his DPS would be very, very low, and then it would suddenly spike, and he would have very high DPS for his 6th skill, and then it would go back down. Other characters have very consistent DPS where it's always strong throughout, like someone more like Captain Marvel, where she doesn't have these huge spikes, but it's just kind of consistently high DPS. But I just kind of use it in a very simple way. This character has high DPS, this character has low DPS. End of story. The next one I want to talk about is GBI, and it's known as Guard Break Immunity. And Guard Break Immunity, you should know by now, means that you won't get interrupted during your skills by an enemy's attacks if they have super armor penetration. Because if they have super armor penetration and you don't have guard break immunity, you will get guard broken. Or if you don't have super armor and they don't have penetration, but you also don't have guard break immunity and they have a skill that guard breaks, you will be interrupted. Guard break means that your character gets interrupted. They stop what they're doing and they try to perform an auto attack or like a basic attack. And so guard break immunity prevents that. However, we've covered it in a separate video about Jean Grey. There are still skills that will break guard break immunity, so it's kind of really dumb, but that's what GBI stands for. The next one is CC, stun lock, and of course GBI penetration. CC stands for crowd control, and these are basically any kinds of skills that will control a crowd. It doesn't have to be a crowd, it can just be one character, but we're just basically looking at any skill, or we're talking about any skill that provides any sort of negative effect that will do something to your character by preventing something about them to happen. I'm being extremely vague with the wording I'm using. Basically, if it stops your character from moving, if it stops your character from attacking, if it stops your character from doing something that they would normally be able to do, then that is crowd control. So if it stuns them, if it paralyzes them, if it binds them, if it snares them, if it freezes them, if it time freezes them, I don't know why I'm on Corvus. He actually doesn't have that many different effects. He has a hidden freeze or a hidden paralyze on his piercing strike skill. But any sort of skill that does that, any fear effect, anything like that would be considered CC, aka crowd control. Even Dr. Doom has it on his 5th skill where he has a bit of a time freeze. He's like a 1-second time freeze on his 5th skill when he's charging up the rocket blast to fire off. And then stun lock is an ability where basically, not an ability, it's basically a combo that you can pull off pretty much exclusively in Shadowland with a character like Karnak. There are definitely other characters that can do it, but for example Karnak, where you basically attack the opponent just going through all your skills and they never have the chance to attack back because they're constantly being hit, constantly being sort of stunned. So stun locking is basically just attacking them fast enough with enough stuns in between each attack that they don't have any chance to respawn and they're basically just shut down until you kill them or you run out of time. Another example would be Baron Mordo's auto attack. If you've ever seen that video that I've done, or there was a Chinese YouTuber who posted the original video, try out Baron Mordo without his uniform in Shadowland and just hold down his auto attack. You will see the stun locking happening because the enemy just keeps getting hit and keeps rocking back and forth, and because his attack speed is fast enough, they never get out of the attack. The next one I want to talk about is rotations. We talk about rotations in the game. We mentioned these things. We also mentioned skill canceling. So a rotation is basically just a set number or a set order of skills that you will do for a character. And generally speaking, the rotations that you use for PvE are rotations that will provide the maximum amount of damage. So in the case of Cable, doing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 is a really bad rotation because it doesn't take advantage of skill canceling, which is another important part of rotations, and it also doesn't maximize his damage. A good rotation for Cable would be 4 with a delayed cancel, 2 with a cancel to 3 with a cancel to 5. That's a rotation. It provides a very direct way for you to apply your skills in quick succession in order to do the most damage. Skill canceling is when you interrupt a skill during part of its animation to get the effects of the skill and possibly to get some of the negative effects on the enemy, but then to quickly go into another skill. So rather than just pressing 5, if I skill cancel 3 into 5, I will gain the accumulation, the true damage, and the other effects of the 2 seconds and things like that. Of the third skill. If I quickly cancel 2 into 5, I will also get that crit rate bonus from Calling Providence, his second skill. So likewise, if I cancel 2 into 3 into 5, I can get all of those stat bonuses and all those buffs. I can stack them on top of each other, on top of stacking attacks, chain hit damage, etc., and that would be a rotation. Rotations can absolutely be different for GBR, for World Boss Ultimate, for ABX, for PvP, but just knowing that characters have rotations and then trying to learn them yourself or learning them from other players or checking out my rotation guide will help you understand how to play that character more effectively. The next one I want to talk about is dot damage versus burst damage. Now this one's a little bit more complicated, but essentially you can understand certain skills as dealing a sudden burst of damage, whereas you can think about other skills as having sort of a damage over time effect. So we can actually go back to Cable for part of this example, because on the one hand, where the hell is Cable? Because on the one hand, he has, good sustained damage, but also good burst damage on his 5th skill, because it starts doing damage right away. It starts doing like the full amount of damage as soon as it starts hitting you. But he also has a dot damage over time with his 2nd skill. You can see there it hits you over time. And so there's a window of 3 to 4 seconds where you'll be taking damage, but you're not taking it all at the same time. And same thing with his 1st skill. He does a little bit of damage, but then he leaves this flame on the ground, and the flame will hit you and do damage over time. Damage over time is important for some skills, and burst damage is important for other skills. Sharon Rogers' 6th skill, her ultimate skill, is heavy burst damage, whereas her 5th skill kind of has damage over time because it leaves that red sort of spear lingering and it passes through the enemy and hits them. Generally speaking, burst damage is better than dot damage in Marvel Future Fight, but that's not always the case with every character in every situation. The next one I want to talk about is base kit. Base kit is essentially what the character has specifically for their skills, but not necessarily exclusively their skills and passives, but it's basically the character naked. So we're not talking about Uru, ISO, cards, we're not talking about obelisks or CTPs or uniforms. We're just talking about the character as they are, their base kit. So Scarlet Witch, Silver Surfer, these are characters with very strong base kits. Lots of different effects, lots of meta effects that they get from just their base skills and their base passives that make them potentially strong forever. So the fact that characters like Quicksilver and Strife have penetration as part of their base kit makes them a lot stronger than other characters that perhaps need to get penetration or guaranteed, consistent penetration from their uniforms or from their tier 3 skills or from other skill buffs or from CTPs. So that is an important distinction to make. Characters with strong base kits are usually very strong for the duration of the game. They never get weaker because they'll always have some value because it's in their skills. It's in their DNA. It's imprinted on them as a character. The next one I want to talk about is AoE. AoE refers to area of effect, and that is basically how large of an area are you hitting in. So in this case, his 1st skill has a pretty low AoE. It does hit 3 characters, but they have to be pretty close together. If I happen to single one character out, you can see it's got decent AoE, but it's nowhere near the AoE of, let's say, his 5th skill. You can see his 5th skill is hitting literally every single enemy around me, almost every single enemy, actually pretty much every single enemy in the arena. Likewise, his 4th skill with the board flying around also happens to hit most of, if not every enemy there. You can see here his second skill has a bit of a smaller AoE where it's actually only targeting 1 or 2 enemies, and even if I position it well, it's going to hit that right side of enemies, but it's not going to hit the left side. So that is a skill with less AoE versus his 5th skill, which has tremendous AoE. This is particularly important for things like Alliance Tournament and Alliance Conquest, but it's still important for Shadowland because you can have rumbles where you hit all 3 characters at the same time. So having a lot of AoE on your skills is good. It's just not going to make a character good or bad. You can have a character with very low AoE like Captain America or Cable, then they can still be very, very strong. It's just a little bit more difficult in certain situations for them to shine. The next one I want to talk about is accumulation. Accumulation just means a buildup of damage. Now, there's 2 types of accumulation. There's accumulation when you have damage dealt to you, and there's accumulation when you deal damage to an enemy. So the first one is the one you're more familiar with. It's Sharon Rogers' 3rd skill. It's Cable's 3rd skill. When they receive damage, it says there 2.5% for each 1% of damage taken. That last word there on the 4th line, damage taken 6 seconds. Damage taken means as you take damage, you will buff your own attack for 6 seconds. You don't really have to worry too much about what the numbers are. Just know that an accumulation buff is good, so you generally don't want to follow up an accumulation buffing skill with an iframe, because if you have to take damage to buff your attack, you want to take damage, and you can't take damage in an iframe against the vast majority of enemies. That's why we don't bring mind control strikers in when we use Captain America and when we use Mr. Fantastic, because they have accumulation. Accumulation when getting hit, when taking damage. So he has true damage that says here accumulates 100% of true damage regardless of defense and dodge. So this is a bit more of a confusing wording, but basically if they don't specify damage taken or damage dealt, you should automatically assume that it's damage taken. They're not really always good. Netmarble's not super consistent about doing that, but on the flip side, they will be consistent, and they are specific when it's damage that you deal. So in the case of Quicksilver's 3rd skill, it says 1% increase all attack per accumulated damage proportional to max accumulated damage, true damage dealt to enemy. So it's either damage taken, which means you take damage, or it's damage dealt. In the case of damage dealt, you don't have to worry about being in an iframe or not. As you do damage, you will accumulate more attack, which will then buff your damage even higher. Storm has the exact same thing on her tier 2 passive, so you just have to continue to deal. Where the heck is Storm? You have to continue to deal damage, and that will then buff your damage even higher. So this is damage dealt to the enemy. So you just have to know when you see an accumulation skill, you just have to figure out, is it damage that I'm taking? So I have to be careful, and I have to try to take damage as long as I can protect myself with an invincibility or immunity skill. Or is it damage that I deal to the enemy, in which case I don't even have to care. I just have to use this accumulation skill in between my procs so I can build up more damage overall through each proc. The next one I want to talk about is rolling and re-rolling. You'll see this suggested a lot for obelisks and ISO 8 sets and cards. And this basically just means you're changing the options. In the case of ISO 8 sets, you're changing the options. You're changing the option on the ISO 8 set that you have. In the case of obelisks, you are sacrificing other obelisks to roll the obelisk. So I'm sacrificing these here to roll up this 2-star obelisk and roll it up to a 3-star obelisk. On the other hand, if I have an obelisk that's already, or card, for example, that's already maxed out, it's already at the maximum level, it's mythic, but I don't like the stats on it for whatever reason. Let's say this one right here, it's 26, 27, it's kind of low stats, even though it's a 180 proc. I can re-roll it by using another obelisk to sacrifice, and you can't see it because of my camera, but I can use another obelisk here to sacrifice, and that will change the option on my CTP of energy, and it will randomize all of these stats. So I'm essentially re-rolling the stats on the CTP of energy. The next one I want to talk about is just throwing up a bunch of other terms and other terminology that we use for resources in the game. So black antimatter, UUK, Mcron crystals, mega rank up tickets, stuff like that. These are just words for in-game items that you can farm for, that you can purchase, that you can get through events, and we just use these offhand terms to refer to them because it's just easier. Normally you won't see people talking about these. You will see people say like I need more UUK, but you'll also see people typing this out a lot. The next one I want to talk about is debuff and debuff removal. Now, a debuff is anything that is a negative buff that's placed on your character, so you can think of it as CC, as crowd control that we've talked about earlier, but it's also things like all defense down. All defense down doesn't actually do anything to your character's movement. It doesn't impede your movement or stop you from moving, but it does have a really strong effect on the damage you take because it reduces your defenses. Same thing here with 80% chance of missing an attack for 3 seconds. That's a debuff. So if you have effects that debuff, they basically put a negative effect on your character, weakening them in some way, making it harder for them to deal damage. And then on the flip side, if you have something that increases debuffs like Enchantress's leadership, that will make the debuffs last longer or have an even stronger effect. Debuff removal is any leadership like Silver Surfers, any leadership like Dr. Doom's, Odin's, Jean Grey's, Strife's, Wasp tier 2 passive, Angel's leadership as well. When you get debuffed, when you have a negative buff applied to you, it removes all debuffs and it keeps you non-debuffed for 12 seconds. Right now there's only one ability that will ignore debuff removal, which is Fracture. So even if you have Fracture stacks and you have debuff removal, it will not remove the Fracture stacks, and you can continue to accumulate Fracture if the enemy continues to hit you with skills that deal Fracture as a debuff. So that's the one debuff that dodges debuff removal. The next one I want to talk about is the different types of characters. We talk about Paywall, we talk about Crystal Wall, we talk about Bioselector characters, and we talk about Shifter Bios. So a Paywall character is referred to as a character that you have to pay real money to unlock. So basically any character that you can't get without spending money will be considered paywall. So Kid Kaiju is paywall. Agent Venom is paywall. If you have to pay real money, either through this subscription or the Exchange subscription, they would be paywall. Someone like Nick Fury is not technically paywall. He's sort of half paywall, half crystal wall, because you can pay 2,500 crystals to unlock him at tier 1. Likewise, a character like Emma Frost or a character like Sabretooth, these would be crystal wall characters because they are behind a crystal wall. It's just a metaphor of how to obtain the character. Bioselector characters, pretty obvious, characters that can be gotten through bioselectors, so either the bioselectors that you get every day for your daily boxes, or bioselectors that you can unlock through Shadowland or purchasing things in the shop, etc. And then bioshifters are characters that appear in the subscriptions, but they also appear in game mode. So we're talking Gwenpool, we're talking Inferno, and we're talking Vulture. They would appear in the special missions for the 3 respective groups, and so they can be obtained that way, or they can be obtained, where the heck is Inferno? Or they can be obtained through purchasing one of these sets and then just collecting their bios that way. One of the last ones I want to talk to you guys with is synergy and synergies. So I talk a lot about items or certain characters synergizing with each other, or I say like this CTP synergizes with this character. And what that essentially means is that there are some things about the character's base kit, or there are certain things about the character's overall build that will match or mesh really well with something else, usually an item, possibly a team. So in the case of something like Wave and Namor, it's very obvious to see what the synergy is because Wave's leadership applies an extra bonus to Namor. So you can see the synergy right there. It's very easy to see. A synergy that's maybe harder to see is why the CTP of Rage is so good for Captain Marvel. Part of the reason why it's so good is because the CTP of Rage has a very potent effect. That's 0.9% increased damage per 1%, and the ignore boss damage decrease by 60%. What the synergy is basically that those effects are so strong to have those effects amplified. They're amplified because of Captain Marvel's tier 2 passive Carol Core. It increases all buff effects by 20% and the duration by 30%. So that 60% decrease actually goes up by 20%. And the duration goes up from 5 seconds to 7 seconds because of the 30% increased duration. So that is why the CTP of Rage is so powerful on Captain Marvel, even more so than any other Obelisk or any other CTP, because she takes those effects and she amplifies them to an even greater degree. If you had a character that had, let's say, increase all HP effects by 50%, then that would synergize really well with like a CTP of Refinement, the Egg, or a CTP of Regeneration, because those both have HP. So if you can improve those HP percents by 50% and you have something that gives like 30% max HP, then you're getting, 45% max HP because it's a 50% increase or whatever. So that is what synergy involves. It's things that will mesh together really well. So a CTP of Rage has crit rate and dodge. This character has a lot of guaranteed crit rate, a lot of guaranteed dodge. Those would probably synergize well. Having a lot of HP on your cards, and then using Victorious, who buffs her attack by having more HP, that is a positive synergy. You can also have negative synergy, but we'll leave that for another video. And then finally, I want to talk about min-maxing. This is something that I've referred to a lot in my videos. I don't know about other people out there in the YouTube world, but this is sort of something I picked up from Diablo and my time playing those ARPGs. Min-maxing is sort of a way of life. It's a lifestyle. It's a choice you make when you're playing video games. So rather than being casual about the way that you play, when you min-max, you're really going for the nitty-gritty details. And essentially min-maxing involves doing the minimum or the maximum to get something out of a certain part of the game. So an example of that would be basically saving up all of your resources and not spending any of them, minimizing all of the spent resources that you have in order to maximize the amount of spent resources that you can have at a particular point in the game. So you do make a sacrifice in the short term for a benefit or a payoff in the long term. One way of looking at min-maxing would also be to sort of play the odds and do the most work that you can in a particular area to guarantee that you'll get the maximum reward that you can. So for example, always spending your boost points when they're available and always having your energy recharging is a way of min-maxing. I'm not min-maxing right now. I have my energy over 130, so I'm not generating any new free energy, and I'm leaving my boost points stagnant at 100. If you're constantly logging in every few hours to play the game, if your sleep cycle allows it, you are min-maxing. Another way to min-max is to constantly check the shield lab and collect this before it overflows and reaches capacity. If you're always able to collect it every 6 hours, you're min-maxing the amount of antimatter that you're able to collect. If you leave it there for 20 hours at a time, you're not min-maxing, and you'd be kind of losing some of those resources. But again, it's all a matter of perspective. It's all a matter of how you want to play the game. So with that being said, hopefully these terminology abbreviations and acronyms have helped you guys out. If there are more that you would like to find out about or that you want me to cover in a follow-up video, hit me up down below in the comments. Thank you so much for watching. Subscribe if you enjoy the content, you want to support me, and of course, if you like what you see, I hope to see you later today. Take care.